The rain fell in sheets of hammered silver against the black glass of the castle windows, a relentless percussion that echoed the disquiet in Caius's heart. He stood before the hearth, the firelight carving his form from the shadows, a king made of marble and midnight. For 600 years, he had ruled this city, this kingdom, a bastion of eternal night against the fleeting, grasping light of the human world. He had seen empires rise from dust and return to it, had witnessed the endless cycle of human ambition, betrayal, and greed. It was a lesson etched into his very being. To be human was to want, and to want was to eventually betray. And then there was Lena. His Lena. A creature of sunlight and soft earth, found shivering in the ruins of a border village his armies had pacified a year prior. She had looked at him not with the terror he commanded, but with a strange, defiant pity. He had taken her, not as a prize of war, but as a curiosity, a baffling anomaly. He had installed her in the heart of his opulent, silent world, dressing her in silks and jewels, feeding her from plates of gold, surrounding her with a beauty so profound it was its own kind of prison. He gave her everything a human heart could desire, and he waited. He waited for the greed to show itself. He waited for the inevitable request, the demand for more power, more influence, a title, a place at his side not just as a consort but as a ruler. He called it a test, a long and patient experiment to prove the truth he already knew. He loved her, an agonizing, terrifying love that felt like a stake slowly twisting in his chest, but he could not trust her. And so he watched her, his obsidian eyes cataloguing every quiet sigh, every lingering gaze at the city beyond the walls, interpreting her melancholy not as loneliness, but as the chafing of an ambition yet to be voiced. Lena felt his gaze like a physical weight, even when he was rooms away. She moved through the vast, echoing halls of Nocturne Keep, a ghost in her own life. The silks felt like shackles, the jewels like cold stones against her skin. She had a library of 1,000 books she could not share, gardens that bloomed only for her, a banquet served for one. Caius gave her objects, but he withheld himself. He would come to her in the deep hours of the night, his touch a desperate, possessive thing, his whispers full of a dark adoration that never once brushed against the shores of trust. He would hold her as if she were the last fragile thing in the world, and then, in the morning, would question the maid on whether she had seemed dissatisfied. She was not dissatisfied, she was suffocating. She loved the man beneath the paranoid king, the slivers of vulnerability she saw when he thought she was asleep, the way his hand would clench on the sheets, the faint line of pain between his brows. She saw a prisoner in a fortress of his own making, and she ached to set him free. But every door she tried was locked by his suspicion. Her discovery happened on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other, marked only by the relentless ticking of a grandfather clock in the grand hall. Driven by a desperate need for a new vista, for something her eyes had not already memorized, she had pushed open a heavy oak door in the east wing, a section of the castle that had been closed for centuries. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the single shaft of moonlight piercing the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of forgotten things, dried herbs, decaying paper, time itself. The room was a mausoleum of furniture draped in white shrouds. In the center of the far wall, however, something hung uncovered, a dark rectangle against the faded damask. It was a portrait. As she drew closer, her slippers silent on the dusty floorboards, the image resolved itself. A woman, seated in a high-backed chair, her gown the color of a twilight sky. Her hair was a cascade of dark curls, so like his own, and her eyes were his. Not the hard, guarded obsidian Lena knew, but a warmer, gentler version, full of a light that seemed impossibly familiar. But the painting was ruined. A vicious tear ran diagonally from the top corner, a jagged scar that bisected the woman's serene face. Water stains bled from the bottom, blurring the intricate details of her dress into a murky mess. Lena reached out, her fingers hovering just above the cracked canvas. She felt an immediate, piercing connection to this unknown woman. This was his past. This was a piece of the man he kept locked away. A nameplate of tarnished brass was affixed to the bottom of the frame. Eleonora. Beloved queen. His mother. The histories said she had been human, murdered by vampire assassins during the Unification Wars, a tragedy that had forged Caius into the ruthless, isolated monarch he was today. He had never spoken her name. He had sealed away this entire wing, trying to bury the memory of her, but he could not bring himself to destroy the last image of her face. In that moment, watching the moonlight caress the ruined painting, a fierce, desperate resolve took root in Lena's heart. It was more than a desire, it was a calling. She would fix this. She would heal this one wound in a man made of scars. She would give him back his mother's face, whole and beautiful, and in doing so, perhaps show him that a human heart was capable of more than just taking. It was capable of giving, of mending, of loving without a price. The decision settled over her, quiet and absolute. This would be her secret. Her purpose. A gift not of jewels or gold, but of memory and healing. A gift bought with something truly her own. The first, and most immediate, obstacle was a paradox of her existence. She was surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet she was penniless. Caius ensured her every need was met, every whim catered to by a silent army of servants. Food appeared, clothes were laid out, fires were lit. But the economy of the castle was one of command, not currency. She had never held a coin in her hand since arriving. The concept was abstract, something that belonged to the world outside. Her plan began with observation. For a week, she watched the castle's rhythms, the changing of the guard, the routes of the servants, the deliveries at the trade gate. She learned that the head housekeeper, a stern, older vampire named Isolde, kept a small cash box in her office for paying local human merchants who brought fresh produce and linens. It was a pittance by the castle's standards, but to Lena, it was a hoard. She couldn't steal. The act itself was abhorrent, and it would only prove Caius's worst assumptions about her. She had to earn it. Her gaze fell upon her own chambers, upon the endless, pointless tasks performed for her. A maid to draw her bath, another to brush her hair, a third to mend a perfectly intact seam on a gown she had worn only once. She started small. She began dismissing the maids, insisting on brushing her own hair, on tidying her own rooms. At first, they were confused, even fearful, certain they had displeased her. "I just prefer the quiet," she told them, a soft, apologetic smile on her face. "Please, take the time for yourselves." She learned to scrub her own marble floors, to polish the silver on her vanity, to launder her own delicate underthings in a basin in her bathing chamber. The work was clumsy at first, her hands soft and unaccustomed to labor. But with it came a flicker of satisfaction, a sense of agency she hadn't felt in a year. It wasn't enough. The work of one person in a gilded cage saved the crown nothing. She needed to get out. The castle had one weak point she had identified, a small, postern gate used by the gardeners, which opened into the lower city. It was guarded, but by a young vampire named Lucian, who seemed more interested in the romantic poetry he was always reading than in his duties. He was new, still possessed of a softness the older vampires had long since lost. Her escape required a performance. One evening, she feigned a headache, retiring to her room early and refusing dinner. She waited until the deepest point of the night, when the castle was as still as a tomb. Dressed in the plainest, darkest dress she owned, a servant's cast-off she had found and hidden, with her hair tucked under a rough wool shawl, she slipped from her chambers. The hallways were long corridors of shadow and moonlight. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a thunderclap. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. She reached the gardener's gate. Lucian was there, as expected, his head bowed over a slim volume, his face illuminated by a single lantern. She didn't try to sneak past him. She stepped into the light. He shot to his feet, his hand instinctively going to the sword at his hip, his eyes wide with alarm. "My lady, what are you?" "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, a tremor that was only half feigned. She held out a small, perfect rose she had plucked from the conservatory. "I cannot bear the silence tonight. I only wish to walk in the moonlight for a moment. To feel the air." She looked at him, her eyes wide and pleading. He worries so. He would never permit it. But the walls feel so close tonight." Lucian was caught. Duty warred with a nascent chivalry, a romantic notion of a sad princess in a tower. He saw the rose, a symbol from his poems. He saw the genuine distress in her eyes. He looked back toward the silent mass of the keep, then back at her. With a sigh that fogged in the cold air, he unlatched the gate. 10 minutes, my lady. No more. If the king were to learn of this. He will not. Thank you, Lucian. She gave him a grateful smile that made the young vampire blush. She slipped through the gate and into the winding, cobbled streets of the human sector. The change was instantaneous and overwhelming. The air in the castle was cool, clean, scented with beeswax and old stone. Here, the air was thick, alive, a chaotic stew of wood smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and damp earth. The silence of the keep was replaced by a cacophony, distant shouting, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the mournful song of a drunkard weaving his way home. She clutched her shawl tighter, pulling it over her face, and hurried through the labyrinthine alleys. The poverty was a physical blow. Houses leaned against each other for support, their timbers warped and grey. Faces peered from shadowy doorways, gaunt and suspicious. This was the kingdom Caius ruled, the people he protected with his cold, detached power. He kept them fed, kept them from war, but he did not know them. He did not see this. After asking for directions from a wary street vendor, her voice barely a whisper, she found her destination, a small, cluttered shop tucked away on a street named Artisans' Row. A faded wooden sign swung above the door, bearing the image of a paintbrush and palette. The name Elian, Restorations, was painted beneath it. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. A small bell chimed. The shop was a wonderland of broken things waiting to be made whole. Canvases in various states of repair leaned against the walls, a fractured porcelain doll sat on a shelf, a cello with a cracked neck rested in a corner. The air smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and old wood. An old man emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a stained rag. He had a cascade of white hair, a face mapped with wrinkles, and eyes the color of faded denim that were surprisingly sharp. He looked her over, his gaze taking in her rough dress and the fine bones of her face. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Lena's hands trembled as she unwrapped the small, folded section of canvas she had brought with her, a corner of the painting's background she had carefully cut away, a piece that would not be missed but would show the extent of the damage. "I have a painting. An heirloom. It's been badly damaged." She placed the fragment on the counter. Master Elian picked it up, holding it to the light. He ran a gentle, calloused thumb over the cracked paint. He sniffed it. 16th century, by the look of the gesso. Oil on linen. Significant water damage, and, this tear. It's clean. Deliberate. Done with a blade. His sharp eyes flicked up to meet hers. A crime of passion, perhaps. Lena flinched. "It needs to be repaired. Can it be done?" He studied the fragment for a long moment. "The tear can be rewoven. The canvas can be relined. The water stains, difficult. The colors will need to be matched perfectly. It requires time, patience, and skill." He set the piece down. "And coin. How much?" she breathed. He named a price. The number was so vast, so impossibly large, that the air left Lena's lungs in a rush. It might as well have been the moon. She felt a wave of despair, so potent it made her dizzy. Seeing the look on her face, the old man's expression softened slightly. "It is a master's work to restore a master's work, child." "I don't have it," she whispered, her voice cracking. Not all at once an idea, born of desperation, sparked in her mind. "But I can get it. In pieces. Can I pay you as I earn it? A little each week. You would not have to begin the work until I have paid a quarter of the price. And you would not have to give it back to me until the final coin is paid." Elian looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the desperation, yes, but beneath it, a core of steel. He saw the fine, aristocratic lines of her face at odds with her common dress. He was an old man who had seen much of the world, and he knew a story when he saw one. There was a secret here, a powerful one. "You want this painting restored very badly," he said, his tone less a question than a statement. "It is everything," she said, and the simple truth of the words hung in the air between them. He was silent for a full minute, studying her face. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Bring the painting. I will keep it safe. You bring the coin as you can." We will have a contract, he smiled, a faint, wry twisting of his lips. And I will trust that a woman with your determination is a better investment than a nobleman's bond. The next challenge was earning the money. Dismissing her maids was not enough. She needed a real job, one that paid in coin, not room and board. Her nightly walks, sanctioned by a now complicit Lucian who believed he was aiding a tragic romance, became her lifeline. She explored the lower city, not as a tourist, but as a supplicant. She was refused at every turn. Her hands were too soft for the laundries, her frame too slight for the bakeries. She had no discernible skills. She couldn't mend nets or cobble shoes or work a forge. The polite society she came from had trained her to be an ornament, and ornaments had no value here. Her desperation led her to the Gilded Mug, a raucous tavern near the city's main gate, a place that smelled of stale ale, sweat, and sawdust. The proprietor was a large, bull-necked man named Gregor, with a perpetually sour expression. His wife, Marta, was a thin, weary woman with kind eyes. "Looking for work?" Gregor boomed when she approached him, his voice full of derision as he eyed her clean, if plain, dress. "The girls in the back are always looking for a new face, if you've the stomach for it." Lena recoiled, a flush of shame and anger rising in her cheeks. "No. Anything else. I'll wash dishes. Scrub floors. Anything." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. But Marta placed a hand on his arm. She had been watching Lena, had seen the fierce pride warring with her desperation. "We need someone to swill the floors after closing, Gregor. Old Elspeth's joints are too bad now." Gregor grunted. "It's filthy work. And it pays next to nothing." "I'll take it," Lena said immediately, the words rushing out before she could lose her nerve. And so her second life began. Each night, after the last drunkard was thrown out into the street, after Gregor and Marta had retired upstairs, Lena would remain behind. Her world shrank to the tavern's common room, a hell of overturned chairs, sticky tables, and a floor fouled with spilled drinks, mud, and filth. The first night, she vomited in the bucket from the stench. The lye soap was a harsh, burning thing that stripped the skin from her hands. The labor was back-breaking. She hauled heavy buckets of water from the well in the courtyard, her muscles screaming in protest. She scrubbed the thick wooden planks on her hands and knees, the rough bristles of the brush raising blisters on her palms within the first hour. By the time the sun threatened the eastern sky, she was weeping with pain and exhaustion, her body trembling uncontrollably. But as she looked at the clean, dark wood, gleaming wetly in the pre-dawn light, a feeling of grim triumph settled in her. Marta came down to inspect her work. The woman's tired eyes widened in surprise. "Gods, child. You've done a proper job of it." She pressed a few small copper coins into Lena's palm. They were heavy, real, earned. They were the most precious things she had ever held. This became her rhythm. A life of two extremes. By day, she was the king's consort, a creature of silk and perfume, playing the part of the pensive, melancholic beauty. She would read in the library, her hands carefully concealed in gloves, claiming a sudden sensitivity to the castle's chill. She would walk in the gardens, her face pale with a fatigue Caius mistook for ennui. At night, she was a wraith, slipping through the castle's hidden ways to become a scrubber of floors. The work became easier, her body hardening to the task. Her muscles no longer screamed, they ached with a familiar, rhythmic pulse. The blisters on her hands broke, bled, and slowly calloused over, turning her delicate skin rough and red. She learned the particular character of every stain, the ghost of every raucous night. She learned about the city. Marta, seeing her quiet diligence, began to talk to her, sharing stories of the patrons, the struggles of the merchants, the gossip of the sector. Lena learned of families struggling to feed their children, of the sick who couldn't afford an apothecary, of the quiet acts of kindness and the loud acts of desperation that made up the fabric of this world Caius ruled from his stone tower. Her perspective shifted. These were not the abstract, greedy masses of Caius's paranoia. They were people, flawed and struggling and real. Caius noticed the changes, of course. His senses were preternaturally sharp. He saw the deepening shadows under her eyes, the way she sometimes flinched when he reached for her hand, the faint, chemical scent of lye that sometimes clung to her hair despite her frantic washing. He saw her newfound weariness, her silences that seemed heavier than before. His paranoia, a serpent that had slept fitfully for a year, began to uncoil. "You seem tired, my love," he said one evening, his voice a silken trap. They sat in the conservatory, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. "The seasons are changing. It always makes me feel lethargic," she lied, her gaze fixed on a pale orchid. Her back was a column of fire from her work the previous night. Indeed, he reached across the small table and took her hand. She tried to pull back, but his grip was gentle and unyielding. He turned her palm over. Even in the dim light, he could see the roughness, the angry red patches of skin. He traced a new callus with his thumb, his touch as cold as ice. "You have been gardening without your gloves," it was not a question. "Yes," she said, her heart stuttering. "The roses, they have thorns." His eyes narrowed. He brought her hand to his lips, but instead of kissing it, he inhaled, his senses tasting the air above her skin. He did not smell the clean earth of the royal gardens. He smelled something else. Something base and common. Soap. Sawdust. Stale ale. He said nothing. He released her hand and leaned back, his face an inscrutable mask. But inside him, the serpent of suspicion was wide awake and hungry. She was lying. His beautiful, perfect Lena was lying to him. The experiment was finally yielding results. The greed was taking root. He imagined her sneaking out to meet a lover, a coarse, human man who worked with his hands. Or perhaps she had a secret vice, a gambling den, an opium house. The possibilities, each more painful than the last, writhed in his mind. His love and his paranoia began their terrible war, and paranoia was winning. He began to follow her. Not himself, that would be too crude, but through the eyes of his royal guard, loyal vampires who could move through the city like shadows. Their reports were maddeningly vague. She was seen entering the human sector. She would disappear into the warren of streets near the Artisans' Row. Hours later, she would emerge, always just before dawn, and return to the castle. "Where does she go?" he snarled at his captain, a centuries-old vampire named Valerus. "We cannot follow without revealing ourselves, my king. The streets are too narrow, the humans too numerous. She melts into the crowds. Find out," Caius commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I want to know what she is buying. Who she is buying it for." He was certain it was for herself. Some secret indulgence, some bauble she craved that she was afraid to ask him for, proof of the insatiable wanting he knew was at the core of her species. Meanwhile, Lena's hoard of coins grew with agonizing slowness. Every few weeks, she would have enough to make a payment to Master Elian. These visits were her only solace. She would slip into his quiet shop, the scent of oil and turpentine a balm to her soul. He would take her small, heavy pouch of coppers and silvers without comment. "Let me show you," he would say, leading her into the back room. And there, on the easel, she would see the miracle taking place. Slowly, painstakingly, Eleanora's face was re-emerging from the damage. Elian had carefully rewoven the canvas, the jagged tear now just a faint, hairline seam. He was meticulously cleaning away centuries of grime, revealing the original, vibrant colors. The twilight blue of the gown deepened, the pearl earring in the queen's ear regained its luster. Most importantly, the warmth was returning to her eyes. "You see," he said, pointing with a fine-haired brush. "The artist used a glaze of crushed lapis here, in the shadows of the fabric. An expensive choice. A royal commission." He spoke to her of technique, of pigments and binders, but what she heard was a story of love. The love of the artist for his work. The love of the king who had commissioned it. The love of the subject, whose gentle spirit seemed to soak through the canvas. These moments were what kept her going. They were the fuel for her aching body, the antidote to her lonely soul. She was not just scrubbing floors, she was buying back a piece of a forgotten queen, a lost mother. The weeks bled into months. Summer turned to a crisp, golden autumn, which then gave way to the biting cold of winter. Lena grew thinner, her face sharper, but her eyes held a new light, a secret fire that Caius mistook for the glow of deceit. Their interactions became strained, a delicate, dangerous dance around the unspoken chasm that had opened between them. He would shower her with gifts, a necklace of black diamonds, a gown spun from moonlight, and watch her face for a reaction. Her gratitude was polite, distant. The gifts meant nothing to her, and to him, this was the most damning evidence of all. She didn't want his gifts, she wanted the ones she was buying for herself, with her secret money, in her secret life. Finally, the day came. It was late afternoon, the winter sky already a deep, bruised purple. Lena stood in Elian's shop, her hands clasped before her. The portrait was finished. It was breathtaking. Elian had worked magic. The tear was invisible, the colors rich and luminous, as if it had been painted only yesterday. Queen Eleonora's eyes, so like her son's, shone with a gentle, knowing wisdom. She looked alive. "It is done," Elian said, his voice full of quiet pride. Tears welled in Lena's eyes. She's beautiful. "Thank you, Master Elian. The thanks belong to you, child. I have never seen such devotion." She counted out the final payment, her entire savings, onto the counter. The coins, a mix of copper, silver, and a few precious gold pieces she had earned when Gregor had hosted a rowdy noble's feast, made a small, sad pile. It was just enough. She had nothing left over. Not even enough for a carriage ride back to the keep. Elian wrapped the large canvas carefully in waxed oilcloth, tying it securely with twine. "A storm is coming," he warned, his gaze going to the darkening window. "You should hurry." "I will," she promised, lifting the surprisingly heavy package. "Thank you. For everything." He simply nodded, a deep respect in his ancient eyes. The first flakes of snow began to fall as she stepped out of the shop, icy pinpricks against her cheeks. The walk to the castle was long, uphill, and would take her nearly 2 hours. She clutched the portrait to her chest, her body a shield to protect it from the weather. The wind began to howl through the narrow streets, whipping her thin cloak around her and biting at her exposed skin. The snow turned to sleet, then to a driving, freezing rain. The streets emptied as people rushed indoors. Soon, she was the only one left, a small, solitary figure battling her way through the storm. The oilcloth was slick, the package unwieldy. Her arms ached, her hands, raw from the previous night's work, were numb with cold. The hem of her dress was soaked and heavy with mud. Every step was a monumental effort. But her only thought was of the precious thing in her arms. She had to get it home. She had to give it to him. Today was his birthday. In the castle, Caius was in a state of cold, controlled fury. His birthday was a day he despised, a reminder of a life he had lost, a humanity he had shed. He endured it, year after year, a hollow ritual of fealty from his subjects. But this year was different. This year, Lena was gone. A guard had reported seeing her leave the city gates at midday, carrying a large, flat package. She had been gone for hours. The storm had broken, and still, she had not returned. His imagination, poisoned by months of suspicion, ran rampant. She had finally done it. She had taken his name, his unspoken credit, and had gone on a shopping spree for herself on his birthday. The package was undoubtedly some expensive frippery, a mirror or a tapestry, something to adorn her chambers. The audacity of it, the sheer, human greed, was a physical pain in his chest. He had given her a world, and she had snuck out to buy trinkets. He paced the length of the great hall, his boots echoing like gunshots in the cavernous space. The fire roared in the hearth, but he felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He had sent Valerus and a dozen of his best guards out to find her, to bring her back. He wanted to see her face when she was caught. He wanted to see the proof of her betrayal with his own eyes. He felt the moment Valerus found her, a faint thrum through the mental connection he had with his senior guards. They were on the old King's Road, the path that led from the lower city to the castle's main gate. He swept from the hall, his long black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a predator. He would meet them there. He would have his confrontation away from the prying eyes of the court. Lena saw them from a distance, dark figures on horseback materializing out of the swirling rain and gloom. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a rescue party. But then she saw the lead rider, his posture rigid, his face a grim mask. It was Caius. And he was incandescent with rage. He dismounted before his horse had even come to a full stop, striding toward her through the mud and driving rain. The force of his fury was a palpable wave that washed over her, more chilling than the storm. Well, well, he sneered, his voice a low, venomous rumble that cut through the howl of the wind. He stopped a few feet from her, his sheer physical presence overwhelming. He was immaculate, his fine clothes untouched by the storm, while she was a drowned, mud-spattered wretch. "Enjoying your excursion?" Lena trembled, from cold, from exhaustion, from the raw fury in his eyes. She couldn't speak. She could only clutch the precious package tighter. His gaze dropped to the oilcloth-wrapped rectangle in her arms. A cruel, humorless smile twisted his perfect lips. "Outspending my name? Buying yourself a pretty gift for my birthday?" How thoughtful. He took a step closer, his eyes burning into hers. "What is it?" "A mirror, so you can better admire the face that has bought you so much. Silks from the eastern provinces? Jewels?" "Caius, please," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "It's not what you think." "Oh, I think it is precisely what I think," he snarled. "I have given you everything, and it was not enough. You had to sneak and lie and creep out of my home like a thief to satisfy your wanting." He reached out, his hand grabbing the top of the package. "Let me see it. Let me see the price of your deceit." "No, don't," she cried, a raw, desperate sound. She struggled, trying to hold on, but he was impossibly strong. With a single, violent rip, he tore the oilcloth away. The rain-slicked material fell into the mud at their feet. He looked down, his face a mask of contempt, ready to see some gaudy, expensive trinket. And then he froze. The rain beat down on the restored canvas, but the oils repelled it. Droplets beaded on the surface like tears. Staring up at him from the mud and the storm was his mother's face. Whole. Young. Her eyes, so like his own, were filled with a gentle, loving light. It was not the ruined, slashed memory from the forgotten room. It was her. It was Eleonora, as he remembered her from the sun-drenched days of his mortal childhood, before the blood and the fire and the long, cold centuries of his reign. The world fell silent. The roar of the storm, the stamping of the horses, his own raging pulse, it all faded into a deafening hush. His mind, so quick, so brilliant, struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. This was impossible. The portrait was ruined, locked away. His gaze, stunned and uncomprehending, lifted from the painting to Lena's face. She was weeping, silent tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. And then his eyes fell to her hands. Her hands, clutching the edges of the frame, were a wreck. They were not the soft, pale hands of a pampered consort. They were red, raw, the knuckles swollen. The nails were broken, the skin on her palms thick with calluses and crisscrossed with healing blisters and fresh cuts. As he stared, his vampire senses, heightened by the shock, picked up the scents he had ignored for months, now amplified by the rain. The faint, sharp smell of lye. The sour tang of stale ale. The grime of hard, honest labor. The portrait. Her hands. The secret trips into the city. The lies about gardening. The exhaustion he had mistaken for boredom. The money, she had no money. She had earned it. The realization did not strike him like lightning. It washed over him like a slow, inexorable tide of ice, freezing him from the inside out. He saw it all in a horrifying, crystal-clear panorama. Lena, on her knees in some filthy tavern, scrubbing floors. Lena, hauling buckets of water, her slight frame trembling with effort. Lena, carefully counting out coppers and silvers to a craftsman. Lena, walking for miles in a storm, soaked and freezing, all to save the last few coins of a fare so she could bring this home to him. She had not been buying baubles for herself. She had been buying him a memory. She had sacrificed her comfort, her pride, her dignity. She had scrubbed the filth of strangers from a floor to heal a wound in him he had never shown her. The sheer, staggering magnitude of her love, of her sacrifice, struck the foundations of his 600-year-old world and brought it crashing down. His paranoia, his cynicism, the bitter certainty of human greed that had been his shield and his creed for centuries, it all shattered into dust. He had been testing her, waiting for the smallest hint of selfishness, while she had been performing an act of the most profound and selfless love he had ever witnessed. He had not been her jailer. He had been her trial. And she had passed it with a grace that shamed his very existence. He was the monster. He had always been the monster. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, strangled cry of a name he had not spoken in centuries. Eleonora. He looked at Lena, truly saw her for the first time. He saw not a greedy human, but a woman of terrifying strength and boundless love. He saw the queen who stood before him, shivering in the mud, her only crown the fierce integrity in her tired eyes. And Caius, the vampire king, the lord of Nocturne, the immortal tyrant who had never bowed to anyone, did the one thing he had thought impossible. He fell to his knees. The mud soaked through the fine wool of his trousers, cold and thick. The rain plastered his dark hair to his skull. He knelt before her, his head bowed, the restored portrait of his mother lying in the muck between them. The mighty king was brought low, not by an army or a rival, but by the calloused hands of a human girl. Valerus and the guards watched in stunned silence, their immortal faces etched with disbelief. They had never seen their king show a moment of weakness, let alone such a complete and utter collapse. Lena flinched back, a gasp escaping her lips. She thought he was mocking her, that this was some new, cruel form of torment. But when he looked up, she saw his face, and all fear fled. His eyes, those hard, obsidian shields, were shattered. And in their depths, she saw an agony so profound, so ancient, it stole her breath. A single, slow tear of blood traced a path down his pale cheek, a crimson mark of his shame. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice broken, raw, stripped of all its power. It was the sound of a soul cracking open. "Lena, forgive me." He reached not for her, but for the heavy, ermine-lined cloak on his shoulders. He unclasped it and, with a reverence that bordered on worship, he draped it around her shivering form. The cloak was warm and impossibly soft, smelling of him of old parchment, cold stone, and a faint, masculine scent of night air. It enveloped her, a royal standard of surrender. He then reached down and gently, so gently, took her ruined hands in his. He lifted them to his lips, his cold breath ghosting over her raw skin. He kissed each blister, each callus, each broken nail. His lips were cold, but the gesture was the warmest thing she had ever felt. It was an act of penance, of veneration. "I saw only what I expected to see," he choked out, his forehead now resting against their joined hands. "I was blind. I was a fool." He looked from her hands to the portrait, then back to her face. "You did this. For me." Lena's own tears began to fall again, but they were not tears of sorrow or exhaustion. They were tears of release. He saw. After all this time, he finally, truly saw her. She reached out with her free hand, the one not held in his grip, and touched his face, her rough fingers gentle against his rain-slicked cheek. "I wanted to give you back your mother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to heal a part of you." His control broke completely. A shudder racked his powerful frame. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face against her stomach, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved around him. He was the king, the predator, the immortal. And in the middle of the storm, kneeling in the mud, he was just a man, broken and redeemed by a love he had been too blind to recognize. He didn't walk her back to the castle. He lifted her, portrait and all, into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her through the great gates, past the stunned sentries and the gawking servants in the courtyard. He didn't take her to her chambers, he took her to his own, a vast, Spartan room dominated by a massive hearth and a bed carved from a single piece of obsidian. He tended to her himself, dismissing the flock of panicked servants with a single, sharp glance. He knelt before her again, on the dry, warm marble of his own hearth, and gently eased the muddy, soaked boots from her feet. He washed the mud and grime from her skin with warm water and soft cloths, his touch infinitely careful. He cleaned and salved her hands, wrapping them in soft linen bandages with the precision of a surgeon. He did not speak. There were no words for the depth of his remorse, for the scale of his transformation. His actions were his apology, his service was his penance. When she was clean and wrapped in one of his own silk robes, he sat beside her on the edge of his bed and finally spoke, his voice quiet and heavy. For 600 years, I have believed that love was a transaction. A vulnerability to be exploited. I built my kingdom, my life, on a foundation of distrust. You have single-handedly demolished it. He looked at her bandaged hands. This, he said, his voice thick with emotion, is the greatest treasure ever brought within these walls. Not the painting. The sacrifice. The next morning, the castle staff awoke to a new reality. The first sign was the portrait of Queen Eleonora, hanging in the place of honor in the great hall, directly opposite the throne. It dominated the cavernous space, the queen's gentle eyes seeming to watch over the entire court, a human presence in the heart of the vampire world. The second sign was the king himself. The cold, remote distance was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful attentiveness. He never strayed more than a few feet from Lena's side. He held her bandaged hand in public, a gesture of possession that was now rooted in reverence, not paranoia. But the most profound change was the key. A few days after the storm, he came to her while she was sitting by the window, watching the snow blanket the gardens. He knelt before her, for the third time, and held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a single, ornate iron key. "What is this for?" she asked softly. "It is the key to the postern gate," he said. "And the one for the main gate. And for every other door in this castle. They are all the same now. It is also the key to the royal treasury." He closed her fingers around it. "Go where you will. Buy what you wish. Do as you please. This is not your prison, Lena. It is your home. And you are its queen, in truth if not yet in title." His test was over. He had set out to prove the darkness in a human heart, and instead, had been confronted with a light so brilliant it had banished his own. Lena did not use the key to leave. She used it to bring the world in. She started by visiting Master Elian, this time in a royal carriage, and paying him a bonus from the treasury that left the old man speechless. She commissioned him to begin a school for artisans in the lower city, funded by the crown. She began to walk through the human sector, not as a wraith in the night, but in the daylight, with Caius at her side. He was stiff and uncomfortable at first, his regal bearing at odds with the mud and chaos. But he watched her. He watched her speak to Marta, the tavern owner's wife, with the familiarity of an old friend. He watched her buy a hot pie for a street urchin, her smile genuine and warm. He saw the world not as a collection of potential threats and greedy subjects, but through her eyes, as a tapestry of individual lives, of struggle and resilience and quiet dignity. He learned their names. He heard their stories. He saw the consequences of his detached rule, the poverty that festered in the shadows of his magnificent keep. And, guided by her quiet compassion, he began to change things. He lowered taxes, funded a public infirmary, and rebuilt the crumbling tenements. He began to rule not as a paranoid overlord, but as a true king. Their love, once a thing of darkness and possession, was reforged in the light of this new understanding. The nights were no longer about desperate, silent passion, but about long conversations whispered in the dark. He told her of his mother, of his mortal life, of the pain that had hollowed him out and filled the void with suspicion. He unburdened his soul to her, and she, in turn, shared the loneliness and fear she had felt in her gilded cage. They dismantled the walls between them, stone by painful stone. One evening, months later, they stood before Eleonora's portrait. The hall was silent, the firelight dancing across the canvas. Lena's hands were healed, though faint, silvery scars remained on her palms, a permanent reminder of her sacrifice. Caius took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint lines. "I used to think my mother's humanity was her weakness," he said, his voice a low murmur. "That it was what got her killed. I spent centuries trying to burn it out of myself, to become as hard and impenetrable as this castle's walls." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes full of a love so profound it was a tangible force. "You have taught me it was her greatest strength. It is your greatest strength. It is not greed. It is grace." He brought her scarred hand to his lips, no longer as an act of penance, but as a simple, profound act of love. In the heart of the vampire kingdom, a human queen had taught an immortal king how to live again. The portrait of the mother smiled down upon them, her work, at last, complete.